Welcome back, viewers, to your show, The Nationalist. In our last discussion with Professor Richard Werner, we looked at different aspects of the global macroeconomy, and also we focused on exactly what does it take for a country to achieve good economic growth, robust economic growth, and if you like, call it double-digit economic growth like they did in China, back-to-back for at least 2 decades, and which positioned them as the second largest economy in the world, and perhaps some will argue that on a PPP basis, as a purchasing power parity basis, China is actually the largest economy in the world, even though they demur. Nigeria has its challenges aplenty in terms of growth and development, even though we posture as a giant of Africa, even though we have so much to catch up with. In this edition, we're going to be discussing macroeconomic policies as well, but more focus on monetary policy, including issues of interest rates, issues of inflation rate, and of course the other issues of foreign exchange management for Nigeria. As we know, Nigeria's interest rate level, according to the central bank, it seems to be rearing up. At every point in time, the Monetary Policy Committee keeps increasing interest rates to stratospheric levels in order to curb inflation. Inflation also is at 21%, 0.47 or thereabout, as the last count from the Nigeria Bureau for Statistics. Where is that going? And at what point do we expect a reversal of this high interest rate, which some will argue, is actually more than that on the ground? Of course, a lot of this still has to do with more of the COVID spending and the kind of spendings that happened during COVID, which were not backed by productivity. It seems to be a global phenomenon, but the solutions, every country will have to look for how it gets out of this quagmire and returns to the path of economic growth, as it were. Joining us again today is Professor Richard Werner from Germany. Welcome, Richard. You heard the background that I tried to set in terms of, the kind of macroeconomic indices we're looking at in Nigeria: inflation at 21%, interest rate, the monetary policy rate getting close to 20%, bank lending rates still as high as 30-35% in some places. You'd wonder, of course, what kind of business people can do with that kind of rate level, even though, of course, it seems to be a kind of developing economy phenomenon, as it were. Of course, our foreign exchange rate itself is a big different kettle of fish. The Naira, our local currency, exchanges officially at about 440 to the US dollar, but we have some liquidity challenges in the official market, which drives people to the what they call the black market or the parallel market, which goes as far as maybe 750, But of course, there are some reforms, some serious reforms going on right now, including driving people more towards electronic banking, so that the central bank can get a better handle on money supply for the purpose of monetary policy management. That seems to be quite the bulwark, and it's going to have some sort of salutary effect on the economy and the economic trajectory going forward. So in this edition, we'd like you to help us, to kind of, diagnose some of these issues, and also try to point us to the way forward. One of your very strong arguments is the necessity of banks, especially micro banks, microfinancing, small banks in rural areas, to lend to small companies, to capacitate them. Of course, Nigeria tried to do this in the past, but I reckon that we did it wrongly, because a lot of the SMEs that we financed were basically, importers of goods from China, from Europe, from other places. So they were just basically importing to sell. We weren't really producing organically to export and to be competitive, not even in the African region. Perhaps you can help us look at that strategy as well. Welcome, Richard.
Yes, that is an important point, that when you have a banking system, you have small rural banks that lend firms, even then, the question remains what may be used for what it is. And that's what banks have an important role to play. And of course, banks' activity is coordinated by the central bank. And therefore, that's where the central bank does have a strategic role in setting the scene. And in many countries, the central banks have made it clear to the banking system and the local banks on the ground that they would like the bank loans, which is money, and therefore there is a public responsibility. So the central banks have said to them that they would like this money creation to be used mainly for productive purposes, lending to small firms. But then, as you point out, that alone is not enough. And East Asia, they have specificated that the majorities, or more than half, should go to export businesses. They can be to other African countries and so on. And therefore, you see that of the banking system is quite a powerful, without central planning as such. I mean, we're not talking about and down on every detail. You get, how many screws you should put in something that you then should sell here. No, it's not like that. It is a free market, capitalist economic system, but there is guidance of strategic parameters, and that's what a central bank can do. And it sounds like, from what you're telling me, that was to some extent neglected in Nigeria, that, essentially in taken, which is just being importers and distributors. That's an easy way to earn some money, but doesn't really help the country in the run, as you are aware. But never mind, in every country, there's not always the optimal policies taken for various reasons. Let the past be the past. The good news is we can today change things. Fundamentally, countries that have been successful throughout history, they focus on adding value. Add value. And one consistent definition over time, over history, seems to be if you import mainly raw materials that have low value added content, then you process them, and then you export goods and services that have a higher value added content. That's the formula, that's the secret, and that's what all the successful economies have done. Whether it's when England developed in the 19th century, or when Germany developed a bit later, and the US developed, or Japan developed, or then the East Asian nations more recently developed, what they did. And how did they do this? Well, they made sure that resources are allocated in such a way. Now, you don't want too controlling in allocating resources. We've seen the experiment with the Soviet system. That doesn't work because there's too little freedom, and essentially there is another core fundamental, which is the principle of subsidy. Means that as many decisions need to be delegated to the lowest level of the hierarchy for things to work. And if you have a design of a economic system where decisions designed as taken on the lowest possible level, that's likely to be most successful. And the best combination of having some guidance, strategic guidance, and delegated at the lowest possible level is you have many banks, small banks, lending locally to small firms, and the lending decision should then also include guidance, not exactly which company to lend to. Obviously, that would be that's only for the local loan officer, to make these decisions. But top down, you can give guidance to say, need to support more exporting industries, and the loan can get instruction from headquarters and headquarters from the central bank that they should talk to business and saying, well, how much of your of what you sell actually can be exported to other countries, say in Africa. And if they say, oh, that's very low, but if you keep saying that to all the loan applicants, they will start to get the message and they will start to think about, oh, if we actually do a bit more on exporting side, we're getting more loans from, they like that, they want us to do this. You to change the economy. I've talked about this for a long time, and I've already this was in 2008, 9, 10, about some policy when lots of people were talking about sustainability and the green economy. And I said, well, look, you could just use, if you wanted to, use the banking system and the power to guide. It's slightly too authoritarian because we've there's various institutions where they're saying we're going to impose, or the UN even involved, we're going to impose rules on the green economy, and there needs to be suppression of some activities. But it gives you the idea this is possible. Well, we need to do this in a very decentralized fashion. The best way to do that is to have a banking system with many small banks, and then there is a strategic guidance from the central bank to encourage certain activities. Now, for, say, Nigeria, you'll have certain indigenous resources, and you can, think tanks can come up with proposals on trees can be easily developed if you put your mind to it, what can be done in Nigeria. And I think usually you will find there's just so many exciting opportunities. Well, the next step then is to make sure they're funded. And that can be done through the banking system, some guidance from the central bank. And because they're productive, this is safe lending. Actually, we should briefly talk about this. Some should lend to small firms, but is key. Well, you see, we've seen crises in many countries, and they do happen, it seems, far too often. But almost always the banking crises happen for productive business investment, but instead for the purchase of assets, whether it's property, real estate, land, buildings, or financial assets. Is actually unproductive and does lead to problems. Crisis creation is newly added to the money supply, and when this money is not used for productive investment, you will always either asset price or then you consumer price. That's the problem we're having worldwide at the moment, because from 2020 they did a lot of that. The central banks encouraged or forced banks to a lot. But really focus on is the third possibility, bank lending for productive business investment. And within that, there can be guidance, and this is very easily done. It's so easily done that it's a shame to encourage new businesses, new industries, new sectors in Nigeria that will not just earn money for the local entrepreneurs and the banks, which is great, but in addition help the country, the whole foundation, a whole new future. Because if you join the game of moving up the value added ladder, more on adding value at home and offering those value goods and services to the world, neighboring countries, but can be beyond that, the whole world, then your national wealth will increase significantly. Your of trade, your balance, current account balance will improve. You will find tax revenues will rise. You can pay down debt. You don't need to borrow from abroad anymore. Foreign can be reduced. The budget surplus, budget deficit can be put into surplus. All these things are possible from abroad at all in the 20th century when it built up the Japanese economy. The government had a budget surplus, and the economy was doing extremely well, double-digit economic growth. There was no unemployment. It can be done. It's not a cultural thing at all. There's some key strategic things that need doing, and a central function and also secret to the East Asian economic miracle, if you want to call it that, is really this guidance of bank credit to the high value added and productive sectors. And I think Nigeria could start implementing a project like this. You will, after 2-3 years already see very positive results, and the people will realize this actually works. Let's do more of it.
Wow, you touched the nerve point when you talked about how it may not be necessary for a country to continue to borrow from abroad as they did in Japan. And I must tell you, in Nigeria, we're afraid that we may become locked into a permanent situation of borrowing for, even fiscal stability itself. Just to pay recurrent expenditure and what have you. That's a very serious nerve point. You're going to have to help us to expand on that. And I must quickly say that one of my ambitions is to be able to, at some point, get you down to Nigeria to speak with some of the decision makers very soon, at least maybe the central bank or something, to expand on this idea in a very intellectual atmosphere. That's the first one I want you to look at when we come back shortly. But the second thing I want you to look at is the supposedly inverse relationship between interest rates and inflation. And of course, right now, the Nigeria monetary policy rate is 16.5%. In the last few meetings, quarters of the Monetary Policy Committee, they've been increasing, okay? They've been increasing almost instinctively with a view to be able to slow down inflation. But inflation has also been increasing, albeit at a reducing rate. But I'm afraid that increasing interest rates may spur, a self-inflicted recession itself because of the deleterious effect it has on borrowers and manufacturers. So, we're going to go on a 1-minute break, and then we'll come back, and then you can help us address those questions. Welcome back, viewers, and we'll be speaking with Professor Richard Werner on matters of monetary policy as it affects Nigeria this time around. And of course, he's been giving us some very, very interesting perspective on how to spur growth in our economy. Welcome back, Richard, and I'd like you to continue from where you landed. I gave you two very important questions to help us grapple with.
Thank you very much. Yes. So actually, there's also mentioned earlier this issue of digital currencies and should that be a tool to help because the other tool that's traditionally being used by central banks, as you mentioned, is the interest rate tool. So what we found in many countries now, there's inflation. Result, it seems central banks are raising interest rates, and they're saying that we need to do that in order to fight inflation. Well, that's a whole lot of points. We need to unpack this now. First of all, the fundamental issue concerning inflation, and then we'll talk about interest rate, proposed new tools like central bank digital currencies. We've been told, particularly in European the media, that the current is due to what's happening in Europe. There is a war in Europe. Russian troops are fighting Ukraine, and Europe has imposed on some Russian, trade with Russia. Europe continues to import gas, but that's not forbidden. Russia continues to deliver gas, but we had various interventions, American pressure in particular, to stop that and switch to the much more expensive American gas. So we have a bit of a energy supply war going on there. And of course, surprise, who could have blown up the pipelines to Germany? it seems there's no interest by the German government or NATO countries to investigate who really did this, which is quite strange because they have all the information. And so, of course, the fingers are being pointed at the US and who are quite known for such covert operations, which is a violation of German sovereign rights. There's a contract between there were German facilities servicing Germany, but of course, politically, Germany can do very little about it because formally it's still an occupied country. The 1945 occupation statutes are still on the books. That's by the way. But a lot of people are saying what's happening there, the war, the oil embargo and energy embargo, gas embargo, is what's really causing the inflation. And I've looked at the data and it's very clear this is not true because the inflation started beforehand. The Russian intervention in the civil war that's been going on in the Ukraine since 2014, with the Ukrainian government bombing its Russian-speaking people, and Russia then intervening in February 24th this year to protect the Russian speakers after so many years of civilian bombing, which is a war crime. This intervention happened the end of February this year, 2022. But the inflation was already there in January, in February, even late last year. And therefore, it's clear other factors must have been responsible for this. In fact, the price has gone down to below where it was in February and March. So the energy story doesn't actually make sense. We're quite used to the energy story, though, because that's the story we've been told by some central banks about the 1970s. Remember, there was this inflationary decade of the 70s when we had an oil shock in 1973 and then inflation. Check the data by OPEC, and therefore the oil shock happened in late October 1973. Inflation was significant in 1972. So it's nothing to do with energy, but it was the same story. There was a war, there was an embargo, and central banks are telling us that. And what I found is that in both cases, this year's inflation and also the 1973 year inflation, the causes were entirely central bank monetary policy. It was central bank creating a whole that was used for unproductive consumption, therefore leading to inflation. I mean, just takes a few examples in the US, in Germany, in Japan, in the UK. Bank credit growth was expanded tremendously in 1971, 72, sometimes peaking in late 72 or early 73, and then already going down. Happens from late 73, early 74. Some inflation happened earlier, but it's clear it's linked to the monetary expansion, not the oil shock. And that's true in both. We are doing the right thing by monetary policy because that is really the causal factor behind these things. The embargoes, the wars seem to be wheeled out when central banks want to hide what they've really been doing. So we need to put a spotlight on what they've been doing. They've been expanding money creation in a crazy way sometimes, and the goal is to create this inflation. Why do you want to create inflation? Well, inflation contributes purchasing power. It's usually bad for the general population, ordinary people, so where they're purchasing power. Time it helps the big decision makers and governments, because when you have a lot of national debt, in history it's been the best way for those decision makers to get rid of the national debt at the expense of the majority. You inflate it away because national debt is in nominal terms. If you've got high inflation, suddenly the of this national debt has diminished. very, very sad because it's a very expensive way, socially expensive way to address any fiscal deficit and national debt problem. There are much better ways to do this without hurting the majority of the population. Now, next, interest rates. So they're telling us that they're using interest rates to address this problem. But even that statement is not, if you check, as I've done in my empirical studies, and you can look them up, one reconsidering monetary policy. It's published journal Economics, actually is open source. You find the question I asked is, what is the link between interest rates and economic growth? We're being told, and have been told for decades now on a daily basis, if you raise rates, that's going to slow the economy. If you lower rates, that's going to stimulate growth. But there's no empirical evidence for that. There is no empirical evidence for that. The empirical evidence shows that interest rate and economic growth are positively correlated. They always move together. Positively, not negatively. It's not lower rates, higher rates, low growth, rates, high growth go together. Next, you can test for what happens first. What is statistically the cause of the other? The official story is interest rates cause growth. Low, high growth. Well, there's no such empirical evidence at all. The causation runs from economic growth to interest rates. And we said already, it's a positive correlation. So, find is, what's really happening is economic growth is driven by bank credit creation for business investment. Yeah. That's driving economic growth. It's the quantity of bank credit. That's why I talk about quantitative policy, which is an expansion in credit creation. Then you get more GDP growth, and that leads to higher interest rates. Wow. That is the sequence. In other words, central banks now raising interest rates, meaningless, really surprising. They just follow the high nominal growth that they created through their money creation policies. So money creation, unfortunately, used a lot unproductively, created high nominal growth, and a lot of that is inflation. That is pushing up interest rates, and that's what's happening with a lag. And so this is all we're witnessing. Very predictable. I warned about it 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago.
Thank you. I'll speak to you back end. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, viewers. You've been watching your program, The Nationalist, and we'll be back here next week. Thanks for staying tuned.